So, any questions from our discussions on Wednesday? Okay. In case you hadn't noticed, the TAs have very kindly left copies of the review session there if you weren't able to go last night. So. I think we're at the point of talking about diabetes. We talked about how there are, broadly speaking, two forms of diabetes. There's a insulin-dependent form where the beta cells of the pancreas have been damaged and supplying insulin corrects the defect. And type 2, insulin-independent, where the cells are no longer listening to the insulin that's being produced. And we had started to talk about some of the effects of diabetes. Since glucose is too polar to permeate into cells, in the absence of signals to take it up, the effect is for the blood to become richer and richer in glucose, creating a condition called hyperglycemia. And since the cells don't get the glucose, and since they aren't hearing the signals of the insulin, they think they haven't eaten. And we turn up pathways like gluconeogenesis and serum lipid formation. I think I mentioned that there's a glycosylation of proteins that happens spontaneously. This is a purely non-enzymatic mechanism because glucose is a reducing sugar and its aldehyde can attack groups on proteins. And so the more extreme the blood sugar is, the higher the hyperglycemia, the higher the extent or greater the extent of this non-enzymatic modification will be. And it's often monitored on the hemoglobin of the cells, hemoglobin A1C or something, which is a chemically detectable altered form of hemoglobin, but it's not limited to hemoglobin. That however great the glycosylation of the hemoglobin is, comparable levels of damage are being done elsewhere in the body as well. And this may be part of the reason why there's both neuropathy and kidney damage associated with diabetes. That is, as the neurons are non-specifically glycosylated and as they are starving for energy, damage happens. So the peripheries are especially susceptible to damage in these circumstances. Very classical to see diabetics have feet that are no longer sensitive and then develop infections or whatever. There are also associations with vascular and heart disease, that the elevations in the blood lipids, as you might expect, lead to vascular involvement and can lead and increase the risk of heart attack as well. Another risk of diabetes is cataract formation. You can see here a cataract in the eye, and this is through a mechanism that's a little bit oblique. Here you have the structure of glucose and an enzyme called aldose reductase. So it's clearly a fairly broad specificity enzyme that can take aldehydes like this and reduce them using NADPH. And now you have the sugar sorbitol. You may have heard the name sorbitol in the past. Sorbitol is sometimes present in gum and in candy for diabetics. It's this reaction that leads to the formation of the cataracts because the sorbitol forming inside the eye changes the osmotic conditions in there and precipitates the proteins. Then the lens becomes opaque. On the other hand, eating sorbitol doesn't have this effect. There's no association of cataracts with just eating sorbitol because it's handled through the liver in a different way. We are undergoing a metabolic catastrophe. It is not too strong to speak of an obesity epidemic. One reason to be concerned about obesity is that it is the principal cause of type 2 diabetes. Although some cases of type 2 diabetes happen in lean people, over 95% of them happen in people who are well over their desirable weight. In addition to the impact on diabetes, obesity can affect heart disease. There are some forms of cancer that are elevated with obesity, and joint disease, classical thing of having knees and hips that stop working because they're carrying too much weight. So all of these things make obesity a health concern, quite apart from any kind of feelings people have about obesity itself or from the inconvenience in daily life that obese people experience. It's actually rather remarkable that, for the most part, people can maintain normal body weight when you consider how delicate the balance between intake and energy use has to be. The matter of like a handful of peanuts a day can add up to 10 pounds a year. None of us is keeping the kind of bookkeeping that would be needed for that kind of precision. So there are biochemical mechanisms that, for the most part, do a pretty good job of keeping that balance. There's some reason to think that a protein called leptin plays some role in that. This is a peptide hormone, as you can see, so it acts through peptide hormone receptors. And it is one part of a complicated picture of the ways by which we, in fact, can usually regulate weight correctly. Individuals lacking leptin become vastly overweight, and that difficulty can be corrected by giving them injections of leptin. Most people who are overweight have perfectly normal amounts of leptin, so it's not a panacea. It will not cure everything. Something has changed. In 1900, perhaps 5% of the population was obese. That number had risen to 31% by 1988. The human population has essentially the same gene pool that we had in 1900. There has not been a genetic transformation that has changed the machinery. So something else has happened. And I speak of this as something really not short of a toxic environment. We swim in a sea of advertising that is bombarding us with images of food and of eating. The processed foods that are very widely available have multiple characteristics that make it easy to overeat them. They're very tasty, they're high in fat, they're high in sugar, they're easy to eat. All of those things make their calories far more aggressive than the calories in unprocessed foods. Our country subsidizes foods. There are a number of different industries in which active lobbyists have convinced Congress to put tax dollars into making food cheap. Another dimension of this toxic environment is the automobile culture of the United States. We are a big country. We spread and we spread. We gave up the interurban trolley car, and everybody gets a car now. And so people drive where they could walk. And that this makes a difference is clear when we look at cities like New York City or Washington, D.C., that have a very strong pedestrian culture. People in those cities walk places, and obesity is lower in those cities. We have developed a passion for spectator sports. In 1900, you couldn't watch sports on TV. You probably couldn't even go watch professionals very often. If you wanted to have some involvement with sports, you got some guys and you went down to the corner and you played stickball. Playing sports uses calories. Sitting on the couch, drinking beer and pretzels, eating pretzels, consumes calories. And so this switch from an active athletes to passive spectators is another component of the whole equation. Does it make a difference? Well, there are in the order of 16 million Americans who have diabetes. 16 million. 5 states of Iowa. So you can take Iowa and several of the states around us, and that's how many Americans have diabetes. Mostly, this is type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes, the autoimmune form, fairly small segment of it, and it is not increasing. Most of it is type 2 diabetes, and probably half of them do not know they have diabetes. The number they're claiming here is that 80% of those cases are associated with obesity itself. This is a graph that can show you the change in obesity since 1900. So this is showing you a line in the 1880 to 1900 cohorts showing for different ages. In other words, there's a tendency to get heavier with age, and you can see that in this line of the historical record. But it went from being 2% obese to being 4% obese. It doubled. It doubled from 2 to 4%. The more nearly contemporary line here, you can see a very large proportion of people at every age. The proportion who are obese has risen. Diabetes costs money. 1 in every $7 spent on healthcare and medicine and doctors and so forth is spent on people who have diabetes. If you have diabetes, the healthcare costs for that individual are roughly 3.5 times higher than if you don't have diabetes. For the cases that we know are diabetes, $85 billion. $85 billion. It's a lot of money. But those are only the direct costs for confirmed cases. There are unconfirmed cases. There are the indirect costs like lost days of work and so forth. And that estimate goes over $100 billion. So apart from the human misery, it's expensive. Diabetes does not leap on you overnight. You don't go to bed healthy and wake up the next morning diabetic, except in perhaps the case of type 1 diabetes. And so there's a transition stage called impaired glucose tolerance or prediabetes. And impaired glucose tolerance means you're not as good at handling glucose as someone who has a normal metabolism, but you do not yet have flagrant diabetes. And this is sort of showing you an example of what that might look like. In a healthy individual with normal blood sugar, if you eat a meal here and you watch the blood sugar rise, it'll start somewhere relatively low, around 100, maybe lower. It'll rise a bit, and then it'll go back down. In someone with frank diabetes, you can see that the peak values are over 200. And you can see the very large excursion involved. Someone with impaired glucose tolerance has higher blood sugar, but not as high as someone who is still healthy. So there's this intermediate sort of waypoint on the journey towards diabetes. And part of this is due to differences in how people release their insulin. Can they release it promptly, or is there a delay before they release it? And so what this is looking at is if you take individuals and you give them a large dose of glucose by mouth, when does the blood insulin rise and fall? And here we have someone with normal glycemic individuals. So about 60 minutes after eating is the peak for their insulin release. This is looking now at the insulin, and then it comes back down. Someone who has impaired glucose tolerance has a harder time or delays releasing the insulin and does not release as much. And in someone who has type 2 diabetes, the delay in release is greater still. So since the insulin is being released later and later, the cells get the signal to take the glucose out of the blood later and later. And the blood sugar rises while this process is unfolding. And this is showing you over the course of a day of what this impaired glucose tolerance or prediabetes looks like. Here's an individual who has normal glycemia. Here their resting glucose is around 85 or 90. That's also a quite believable number. A little blip up for breakfast and it's back down. It comes to be lunchtime and they eat lunch. It goes up a bit and comes back down again. Here's an individual with impaired glucose tolerance. They're not as good at handling it as the normal glycemic individual. Substantially higher peak after that breakfast meal. They managed to get it down by lunchtime. It comes back up more than it came up for the other individual and it takes longer to come back down. But it does get back into the normal range. So a person who has impaired glucose tolerance has normal blood sugar when they're fasting, but it can rise too far right after a meal. And here's an individual with frank diabetes, type 2 diabetes. Their blood sugar is always above the range it should be. And although the size of the excursion is probably larger than the impaired glucose tolerance and takes at least as long to come back down. If we look at insulin release in a little more detail, you notice now we're looking at a time scale that's in minutes, not in hours. We can see that there are two phases of insulin release. And here's the individual who is not diabetic. And you give an IV glucose, so you know how fast the glucose is getting to their bloodstream. There is an early phase of insulin release, followed by a later phase, a later and more prolonged one. And so what this is saying is that in normal individuals, the body senses the influx of food or of energy briskly and give sort of a preparatory burst of insulin. It's like, okay, we're eating, I know I'm going to need some, I'll give some right away. I don't know how much I need, so I'll give this little burst right away, and then I'll put out some more when I know just how serious the situation is. So this first phase is part of the reason that there's never a very high rise in the normal glycemic individual. If you look at someone in type 2 diabetes, that early phase is missing. This is a genetic predisposition. And the missing early phase is actually can be detected in individuals who are not even impaired in their glucose tolerance. This is probably the closest we can get right now to the genetic basis for type 2 diabetes, because in an individual like myself who had a mother who was type 2 diabetic, that phase is missing, even though my blood sugar never goes anywhere terrible. My blood sugar never goes anywhere terrible because I watch what I eat and I exercise and I've been able to keep my weight fairly good. But the defect is there, is lurking as a trait. So this is sort of a measure of how long it takes to clear blood sugar and how much of a difference a meal size makes. So we're looking here at several times of the day and several sizes of meal. So the green in each case is breakfast, the blue is lunch, and the yellow is dinner. And so for a small meal, at the end of the day, it takes nearly twice as long to clear the blood sugar. And we see that basically for any size meal. Here's a medium-sized meal. At the end of the day, it takes much longer to clear a medium meal, and so on. But if you have a large breakfast, you can clear that large breakfast in the time it takes you to clear a small dinner. So this is one of the reasons that some people give advice to have your larger meals earlier in the day and your late meals to be smaller ones, because you're going to take longer to recover from that blood sugar excursion. So we're putting together a number of different pieces of how our body integrates the experience of food. But another dimension of it is what foods we eat. And interestingly, different foods have a different impact on our blood sugar. And because the peak height or the peak time is kind of a messy variable, we look at what's called the area under the curve. So you add up the whole area under the curve as a measure of the effect of a food on blood sugar. And here we're comparing two fairly dramatically different foods. We're looking at new potatoes, those perfectly lovely little things that are so fresh in the spring, and kidney beans, the nice stuff that makes chili and so on. And for this measurement, amounts of food were given that each contained 50 grams of glucose. So these two foods had exactly the same amount of glucose. See, down there, 50 grams. But the new potatoes cause a huge swing in the blood sugar, and the kidney beans essentially make none at all. Not quite none, but very, very little. So this is an indication of the fact that the food you eat will affect your blood sugar at least as much as how much you eat of different things. And the things that affect what's called glycemic index are several-fold. So one thing, I wish I had a better graph for this, but it's the only one I saw that made this comparison. How the food is prepared can make a difference. And this is comparing three kinds of wheat flour. Here we have on the yellow line white flour. The magenta line is a coarse flour, a coarse ground where you still kind of see the grains. And then the purple one is cracked wheat. Same amount of sugar given in each meal. And look at the difference in the effect on the blood sugar. That the white flour is almost like giving someone straight glucose. Not quite, but pretty dramatic. Whereas the cracked wheat is a lot lower. And it makes sense, because the body has to break down the food particles more to get the energy out of the cracked wheat. So the less refined, the more fibrous, the denser, the darker the food, usually the lower the glycemic index. We use a number of sweeteners in our meals, and they differ in their glycemic index. Here's sucrose. If glucose has a glycemic index of 100, as you might expect, sucrose would have a fairly high one because it's half fructose and half sucrose, half glucose. And the fructose can be changed over into glucose. So here we have sucrose, not quite as bad as straight glucose, but right up there. Some others that you've heard of. Here's fructose, much smaller effect on the blood sugar. You can see it adds into there as that 20%. There are a number of sugar alcohols with very low glycemic index. Here's xylitol, which you may have run into in chewing gum because it inhibits tooth decay. Sorbitol would be another one, the one we mentioned back on the cataracts. I would like to warn you about maltitol. Maltitol is, technically speaking, a sugar alcohol. It's a sugar alcohol made by hydrogenating starch or starch hydrolysates. And so it is a way of modifying ordinary sugars to make them into sugar alcohols. But the problem is that our bodies can be quite good at turning maltitol back into glucose. Xylitol and sorbitol are structurally different enough. Maltitol, if you're paying money for sugar-free candy and the sugar-free is maltitol, just buy the Snickers. The maltitol is not going to do anything different for you than the Snickers would. So we're talking about a lot of dimensions here, and it seems like it should be a very complicated thing to do. But in fact, eating a diet that would prevent or ameliorate or reduce diabetes can actually be boiled down to a remarkably simple bit of advice. There was an art student who was talking to the dietitian trying to learn how to eat better than she had been. And the dietitian realized she was talking to an art student, and she said, "Eat colorful food." And that will cover a surprisingly large fraction of what's useful to maintain a low glycemic, less diabetogenic diet. And what's interesting is that the healthy food pyramids have been starting to develop, trying to convey some of these things. You've probably seen this one. I guess this is slightly out of date now. The idea that fruits and vegetables are really good for you, that if you're going to be eating starches, here they're saying more starches than you actually need. As we discussed before, you don't actually need any starch. But if you're going to be having starches, it should be whole grains and things like that. And then here you have your meats and your food and so forth. Canada is so much more colorful. Similar kinds of advice. You can see, again, the whole grain character for the most part, fruits and veggies. But what I find rather enchanting about this series of pictures is that the kinds of dietetic strategies can always be adapted to the local cuisine. So here we have America and Canada. We're not all that different. Here we have Mexico and Germany. And here we have cereales. And here they're having a lot less of them coming from cereal. But again, the whole grains, they're including a big chunk of leguminosa, the beans. My husband is in love with beans. Beans have far lower glycemic index for the same amount of glucose than almost any grain. And then they've got these wonderful fruits that we don't get a chance to get here, like guava and stuff like that. Here's a cactus, I think it is. And here's our stalwart German friends who are eating healthily, and they've got, again, their whole grains. And their choices of veggies include cold weather things like broccoli and zucchini and stuff. Even the Chinese diet can be adapted into a healthy diet. So this is, I think, another charming one. The one point I would make here is they have these cute little bags of rice. Rice differs a great deal in its glycemic index, and some have a lower glycemic index than others. The more you need to chew it, the lower the glycemic index. So if it's still cooked al dente, the glycemic index will be lower than if you cook it till it's soft. Here you have the bok choy, eggplant. I don't actually see any soy sauce in there. Okay. So diet is one component in preventing diabetes. The other component that's worth keeping in mind is exercise. That if you look at how we live today compared to 1900, people in 1900 had to do more. They had farm chores. They had schlepping the packages for their boss. They had all kinds of things that we simply physically don't do. And it makes a difference. This was an attempt to prevent type 2 diabetes. These were individuals who had impaired glucose tolerance and really didn't want to have type 2 diabetes, and they were being treated according to different protocols. Metformin is a drug, a good drug for the most part, that can increase the sensitivity of cells to insulin so you get more effort or effect from the insulin you make. And so metformin is one way to regularize blood sugar levels. And you can see that it had a useful effect on preventing the development of type 2 diabetes. So a third of the people who might have gotten it didn't get it. But look at how much more effective an intensive lifestyle is. So by improving activity levels and making an intentional and effective commitment to being active, whether that's the form of active exercise or getting a job that involves movement, whatever, it makes a bigger difference. One of the reasons that exercise makes a difference, if you remember back to our discussions of adrenaline, is that adrenaline is also a way to make sugar enter the cells. And so when you're exercising vigorously, the adrenaline that your body releases stimulates your muscle cells to clear blood sugar out of the bloodstream. So it's one way to clear blood sugar that doesn't need insulin at all. And that's one component of it. There are probably other components as well. Increasing exercise in life is a twofer, or maybe a fivefer, or a sixfer, because in addition to reducing the risk of diabetes, exercise reduces the risk of heart disease, of cancer, of depression. So if you could put exercise into a pill, someone would make billions out of it. Since it's free, we have a hard time giving it away. So. Type 2 diabetes is one of the more insidious diseases. It doesn't happen quick enough for you to notice that it's happening. But the good side of that is it gives you time to intervene. This gives you a sense for the kinds of changes that happen relative to each other. So when in an individual who is suffering from simply impaired glucose tolerance, their insulin sensitivity will fall over time. That is, for a given amount of insulin, blood sugar will fall less. And insulin secretion will rise over time. But they will be able to maintain more or less normal fasting blood sugar because they start pumping out more insulin. During that phase, when they have impaired glucose tolerance, there is already side effects that can contribute to heart disease, because during those excursions of high blood sugar, you're getting some of the other alterations of metabolism. At some point, the pancreas wears out and gives up, and insulin secretion starts to fall. And at this point, blood sugar has to rise because even the resistant cells aren't getting enough insulin to respond to. And as the insulin secretion starts to fall, the blood sugar rises, and now you start to get the microvascular disease, the disease in the kidney and in the retina and things like that, because that's when the non-enzymatic glycosylation starts to happen with the high blood sugar. So a series of events. It's not all or nothing. And it happens over time. If you look here, these are some of those events I was talking about. We're looking at time in years here. And you can see here, if we start looking at just an individual who is obese but does not have impaired glucose tolerance, it might be a matter of 5 to 10 years to develop impaired glucose tolerance. And their post-meal glucose will be up, but their fasting glucose will be all right. Their insulin levels will be rising during that time, and then once and insulin resistance will be rising. Once the insulin levels start to fall, the blood glucose starts to rise, and it's in this range that we start to have the impact of frank diabetes. The fact that it's so slow means it's a little hard to notice it, but it means there's time to do something about it. And fundamentally, it should be a hopeful thing, but it's a rather slow process. Why on earth is such a nasty disease as prevalent as it is? You may remember about half the hands here were up when we asked how many people have it. One hypothesis is called the thrifty gene hypothesis. And this is the idea that if there were a gene that made you good at getting through starvation periods, famines, maybe that gene would be favored. And so the idea here is that the thrifty gene, whenever it has a chance to store stuff, is going to store stuff. Oh, there's some sugar. Let's go store it. Oh, here's a little fat. Let's go store it. And a gene like that would mean that if you had more body fat on you when the famine started, then at the end of the famine, you might still be alive. So the thrifty gene hypothesis is the idea that the metabolic pattern is shifted towards conserving fuel with the long-term benefit of being able to get through famines better. Now, is there any support for this? Well, when we compare the Pima Indians, this suggests that this may be a good explanation. The Pima Indians are a group of Native Americans who live across the two sides of the American border. There's one group of them in Arizona and another that's in Mexico. So these are a tribe of individuals who have been genetically related for hundreds of years, but now are divided by an artificial dividing line. In Arizona, the Pima Indians have access to a Western diet, rich in sugar, rich in fat, automobiles. Obesity is very high in Arizona among the Pima, and diabetes is present in something like 40% of the population. In Mexico, their third cousins and fourth cousins are still living a rural Mexican life. They don't have white flour, they have beans. They don't have a car, they're walking to the field. Most of the Pimas in Mexico are still lean, and the incidence of diabetes is very small. So this is sort of an experiment of nature to let us compare a common gene pool with two very different environments. If you think about what hunters and gatherers did and how they lived, a hunter-gatherer diet was a low glycemic index diet. It was a high-fiber diet. And they spent anywhere from 2 to 5 hours a day being physically active. So the way we lived our lives for 1 million years was consistent with a low glycemic diet and exercise. We see around the world that the rates of obesity rise and the rates of diabetes rise with the introduction of Western diets and cars. So. So a number of people have taken approaches to thinking about this. You may have heard about low-carbohydrate diets. One of the common low-carbohydrate diets is the Atkins diet, in which you count carbs, just count grams of carbs, and that's it. The goal in the more strenuous versions of that is to get the metabolic efficiency or the metabolic balance over into ketosis or towards it. Remember, ketone bodies are the water-soluble things we make out of fat. And so in ketosis, you're drawing on your lipid stores to provide energy elsewhere in the body. In the ketotic state, there's obviously not going to be a lot of insulin around because there's a lot of sugar around. If you read some of the older stuff in the public literature about the Atkins diet, you would think it was lethal. There are all kinds of dire predictions made about people following the Atkins diet. The more closely it's looked at, the less any of these things seem to actually have support from data. Perhaps because when we were hunter and gatherers, we didn't eat many carbs. But there's another kind of evidence about the long-term safety of something like this, which is from older literature. It's not a major part of our current way of treating it, but it's still an effective one, which is that epilepsy can be controlled in many individuals with what's called a ketosis diet. So it was discovered in the 20s and the 30s that putting epileptic children on a low-carbohydrate diet would often control their seizures. And the individuals on those diets, if the care was given to the right balance and stuff, continued to grow and thrive and develop normally. Now, this is a much more severe low-carb diet than any casual dieter is going to pick up. So this would, to me, suggest that the long-term consequences of that approach are not too bad. On the other hand, it can get boring. It can be creative, but it can also get boring. The next stage in evolution, thinking about these things, is the low glycemic index. In dietary thinking that's looking at glycemic index, you're looking at not just the total number of carbs, but the kind of carbs. Are they ones that make a big spurt, like the white flour, or are they ones that have a low impact, like the beans? And if we look at the various things that sort of a shorthand, quick way to remember which things are low glycemic index, whole grains are generally lower in glycemic index than the finely refined ones. Most fruits are not too bad in glycemic index, except I have to warn you about bananas. Bananas are almost like a Snicker bar. And most vegetables have a glycemic index that's low. Obviously, meat and oil have to have a low glycemic index. This is always relative to your activity level. If you're a runner who's preparing for a marathon, you can ignore everything I've been saying. You're going to be burning up all the fuel you've taken. Just to give you a little bit of a feeling for some of these glycemic indexes, this is a table which is a little idiosyncratic because it starts low, rises, and then starts high and goes down. I had to reconstitute the one that was in the handout originally. So peanuts, for instance, very low glycemic index. Bean sprouts, grapefruit. Pizza, not too bad a glycemic index. Low-fat yogurt. Honey, it has quite a bit of fructose, so you're getting to there. Here's bananas have the glycemic index of honey. Remember I said that they were somewhat sweet. Compare oranges to orange juice. The glycemic index of orange juice is higher than oranges. Remember the processing. The more processed it is, the higher the glycemic index usually. Raisins are basically the same as table sugar. They're a lot of fun, but we can't really claim that they're fruit. Honey appears twice there with slightly different numbers. I'm not quite sure why. Watermelon, 72. So watermelon has the highest glycemic index of any fruit that I know of. And then we get into baked potatoes or, have a higher glycemic index than honey, for example. But these numbers are all predicated. The glycemic index is all predicated on 100 grams of glucose in a serving. How will it affect your blood sugar if you take 100 grams of glucose in this food? Well, there's a problem with that, obviously, which is how much of that food you normally eat and how much sugar would the normal serving have. And to correct for that, we have glycemic load. So the glycemic load takes the glycemic index and then corrects it for the typical serving size. What's a typical serving size for that thing? Here we have a glycemic load and glycemic index in two columns, and they're showing the serving size in here. So, for example, here we have apples, glycemic index of 38, but only a glycemic load of 6. Less than half the yogurt, which is almost the exact same glycemic index. Well, that's because apples have a lot of water in them. In a typical serving, you're not going to get as much glucose as you would in a typical serving of yogurt. Here we have carrots and spaghetti. Carrots are actually having a higher glycemic index than the spaghetti. Glycemic index load is different by 5-fold. That's because of the difference in size of the servings and the amount of sugar in those servings. So the glycemic load is probably the best approximation we have to the impact of a food in your diet in terms of your blood sugar. Here we have two things that are almost identical in glycemic index, grapefruit and pizza, threefold, fourfold, almost 5-fold difference in glycemic load because you can't eat enough grapefruit to get 50 grams of sugar in it. And the nice thing is that watermelon comes back, that a typical serving size of watermelon doesn't have so much sugar in it, so you can actually eat watermelon and not feel too bad. So I've put on Icon an exhaustive list of these parameters for foods if there's favorite foods you want to look into and look out. Close off with some thoughts about some alternatives to sugars. Many people are still fond of sweet things and are concerned about the impact of sugar in their lives, whether it's glucose or sucrose or whatever. And so there are a variety of artificial sweeteners out there. Some of you may remember NutraSweet. NutraSweet is aspartame, large controversy about its negative health impact, most of which was nonsense. But more seriously, aspartame is not stable. It will break down over time. So sodas that were sweetened with aspartame, if they were 6 months old, usually didn't taste good. A more recent artificial sweetener is sucralose. And I think sucralose is kind of interesting for a number of reasons. So here's the structure of sucralose, or Splenda, as you may know it. And got its name because it's made from sucrose. And it's chlorinated. So here's a chlorine and a chlorine and a chlorine over there. You'll occasionally see things about, oh, Splenda is terrible for you. It has chlorine in it. Did you know chlorine gas can kill you? Well, yes, chlorine gas can kill you, but you put table salt on your food, and that's got chlorine in it. So it's obviously the state of the chlorine and not the mere fact of the chlorine that makes a difference here. But what's quite interesting is look at that. It is starting off as sucrose, and now we just replaced, some of the molecules with a chloride instead of an alcohol. And yet it's intensely more sweet than table sugar. So that's telling us something. What kinetic parameter or what parameter of our taste receptors would you predict has been changed for sucralose? If you're going to think about our body components, there's obviously some component that's changed. Let's assume it's the sweetness receptor. What component, what parameter, what measurement for it do you think has changed? You can chat with each other about this. Anyone want to venture a suggestion on what property of the sweetness receptor is buried here? Sorry? You want to explain your reasoning behind the Vmax?
It's going to bind at approximately the same rate. It's going to have a greater effect. So that changes the.
Okay, so in other words, you're saying it will bind but have a greater effect, and so you're connecting that with the idea of Vmax. So I see the logic there. But remember that the Vmax, we're talking about a sensor here. We're talking about a receptor. And so I guess the analog of that would be, does it trigger a greater response? And it might do that. That might be the way it does it. The other parameter that might be the variable would be the affinity. That is, if it has a higher affinity for the receptor, it will have an effect at lower concentrations. So you're right that it is possible that it would bind and create a stronger signal inside. I think off the top of my head, probably the affinity is a more likely guess, but you're right that those are both alternatives. But it's doing something so that receptor is firing more for much less stuff, because as you know, you need very little Splenda to have an effect. It's roughly 200 times as sweet as table sugar would be. I thought I would include some things on safety. When I talk about this stuff, people often ask me, well, do you think that Splenda is safe? I have 2 children of mine, and I drank diet soda through both pregnancies. One of my daughters works for Google, and my son is a chemistry physics major. So if the diet soda did anything to him, it's probably a good thing. Otherwise, the world wouldn't have been able to handle him. So I don't think diet sodas are terribly risky. And I included here a connection for you, just sort of an example of thinking about risk and stuff like that. And this is one where I found on the web that someone said, oh, Splenda's bad for your immune system. And so what was it? Well, you track it back a bit. It has an effect on the thymus. It decreased the mean weight of the thymus. The thymus is a little organ that children have that helps them build immune cells. Well, high doses, yes. So the sucralose, which caused effects, was 300 milligrams per kilogram per day. So 3 grams per kilogram per day. For someone about my weight or so, that would mean taking in 200 packets of sucralose. So you have, when you're looking at toxicological studies, you always have to look in the context of how much is actually going to be taken in by somebody. So they were giving, there's another, one of the things that was looking at the threshold was 750 milligrams per kilogram per day. Think about what 750 milligrams per kilogram per day of sodium chloride would do. So you have to always use the maxim that's from toxicology, that the dose makes the poison. Have a good weekend. See you all Monday.